I will start my reading practice from the book Effective Public Speaking by Dale Carnegie. Invitations to be present were dispatched to all the members of Congress, to the President and his cabinet. Most of these declined. The committee was surprised when Lincoln agreed to come. Should they ask him to speak? They had not intended to do so. Objections were raised. He would not have time to prepare. Besides, even if he did have time, had he the ability? True, he could handle himself well in a debate on slavery or in a Cooper Union address, but no one had ever heard him deliver a dedicatory address. This was a grave and solemn occasion. They ought not to take any chances. Should they ask him to speak? They wondered. But they would have wondered 1,000 times more had they been able to look into the future and to see that this man, whose ability they were questioning, was to deliver on that occasion what is very generally accepted now as one of the most enduring addresses ever delivered by the lips of mortal man. Finally, a fortnight before the event, they sent Lincoln a belated invitation to make a few appropriate remarks. Yes, that is the way they worded it. A few appropriate remarks. Think of writing that to the President of the United States. Lincoln immediately set about preparing. He wrote to Edward Everett, secured a copy of the address that that classic scholar was to deliver, and a day or two later, going to a photographer's gallery to pose for his photograph, took Everett's manuscript with him and read it during the spare time that he had at the studio. He thought over his talk for days, thought over it while walking back and forth between the White House and the War Office, thought over it while stretched out on a leather couch in the War Office waiting for the late telegraphic reports. He wrote a rough draft of it on a piece of foolscap paper and carried it about in the top of his tall silk hat. Ceaselessly he was brooding over it, ceaselessly it was taking shape. The Sunday before it was delivered, he said to Noah Brooks, "It is not exactly written. It is not finished anyway. I have written it over 2 or 3 times and I shall have to give it another lick before I am satisfied." He arrived in Gettysburg the night before the dedication. The little town was filled to overflowing. Its usual population of 1,300 had been suddenly swelled to 15,000. The sidewalks became clogged, impassable. Men and women took to the dirt streets. Half a dozen bands were playing, crowds were singing John Brown's Body. People foregathered before the home of Mr. Wills, where Lincoln was being entertained. They serenaded him, they demanded a speech. Lincoln responded with a few words which conveyed with more clearness than tact, perhaps, that he was unwilling to speak until the tomorrow. The facts are that he was spending the latter part of that evening giving his speech another lick. He even went to an adjoining house where Secretary Seward was staying and read the speech aloud to him for his criticism. After breakfast the next morning, he continued to give it another lick, working on it until a rap came at the door informing him that it was time for him to take his place in the procession. Colonel Carr, who rode just behind the president, stated that when the procession started, the president sat erect on his horse and looked the part of the commander in chief of the army. But as the procession moved on, his body leaned forward, his arms hung limp, and his head was bowed. He seemed absorbed in thought. We can only guess that even then he was going over his little speech of 10 immortal sentences, giving it another lick. Some of Lincoln's speeches, in which he had only a superficial interest, were unquestioned failures, but he was possessed of extraordinary power when he spoke of slavery and the Union. Why? Because he thought ceaselessly on these problems and felt deeply. A companion who shared a room with him one night in an Illinois tavern awoke next morning at daylight to find Lincoln sitting up in bed staring at the wall, and his first words were, "The government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." How did Christ prepare this address? He withdrew from the crowd. He thought, he brooded, he pondered. He went out alone into the wilderness and meditated and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. From that time on, records Saint Matthew, Jesus began to preach. Shortly after that, he delivered one of the world's most celebrated speeches, the Sermon of the Mount. Thank you. That's it for the day.